All right, let's just dive right in. We're going to explore a really powerful model that looks at this absolutely critical decade ahead for our entire global system. It's a story about where hard data, human psychology, and the massive choices we face all collide. So this whole thing kicks off way back in 1972, believe it or not, at MIT. A team there built this groundbreaking computer model they called World 3. It was for a report you might have heard of, The Limits to Growth. And its job was to simulate how things like population, industry, resources, and pollution all interact with each other. The projection it spit out was honestly pretty startling. It suggested that if we just kept on with business as usual, the early 21st century would be this huge, dramatic turning point.
Now, I know what you're thinking. A 50-year-old model? That's practically ancient history in computer terms, right? But here's the wild part. For the last 5 decades, researchers have kept checking the model against what's actually happened in the real world, and time again, from Graham Turner's work in the 2000s to a very recent analysis by Gaia Harrington in 2021, they found that our global trajectory is tracking incredibly closely with the model's core scenarios. So this isn't some vague old prophecy, it's a data-driven projection that has stayed on course for half a century. So what that means is, according to this remarkably prescient model, we are now standing at a massive fork in the road. The data is telling us that humanity is at a point where 2 completely different futures are about to split off from each other.
Let's break down those 2 paths. On one side, you've got what's called business as usual 2, or BAU2. Think of this as our current default setting. In this scenario, the system doesn't collapse because we, run out of a single resource like oil. Instead, it's a decline driven by pollution and environmental damage hitting a tipping point, which then causes a really steep drop in our quality of life sometime after 2040. Then, on the other side, there's the comprehensive technology path, or CT. Now, this isn't some perfect utopia. It's still a future with a managed, kind of moderate decline, but it's made possible by an absolutely unprecedented all-hands-on-deck mobilization of green and efficient technologies.
And this is where it gets really serious. The model is flagging this specific decade, the one we're basically just stepping into, as the critical window, the point of no return. The choices we collectively make between now and about 2035 are what will most likely lock us into one of those 2 futures. But choosing that better path, it's a monumental undertaking. The CT scenario, the better one, requires us to improve our technology and efficiency by around 4% every single year, and to keep that up for decades across almost every industry. Now, what's our long-term historical average been? About 1.5%. So we need to more than double our rate of progress and sustain it. We're talking about a mobilization effort on the scale of a world war, but instead of fighting, it's focused completely on innovation and building a sustainable system. Which, of course, brings us to the real heart of the issue here. That's the big question, isn't it? If we can see these 2 roads laid out in front of us, and we know what the better one requires, why is it so unbelievably hard to actually get on that path? Well, the answer isn't just about the tech. It's deep inside our own psychology. Yeah, to really understand this human barrier, we've got to add another layer to our thinking. We need a powerful theory from a completely different field. One that explains why we humans tend to stop cooperating right when we need it the most. Let's talk about something called mimetic desire. It's a concept from the philosopher René Girard. Now, it's a fancy-sounding term, but the idea behind it is actually super simple. Girard argued that most of what we want isn't something we came up with on our own. We learn what to desire by copying other people. We see someone, a model, wanting something, and that act of them wanting it suddenly makes it desirable to us, too. Our desires are social. They're contagious. And this process of imitation, it kicks off a very predictable and often destructive cycle. First, we start by wanting what our model wants. But pretty soon, that person goes from being our model to being our rival, because now we're both competing for the same thing, whether that's a promotion, social status, or resources. As that rivalry gets more intense, the social tension can become just unbearable. And that's when societies tend to find a scapegoat, some person or group to blame for all the problems, which creates this fragile, temporary sense of unity. So what on earth does this have to do with global limits and climate models? Well, everything. Think about it. For as long as the economic pie is growing, there are always new slices to go around, right? That helps keep these rivalries in check. But what happens when the pie stops growing, which is what both the BAU2 and the CT scenarios predict? Suddenly, the game feels zero-sum.
Any gain for you is perceived as a loss for me. And you can see how this creates this awful, vicious feedback loop. Economic stagnation fuels intense social rivalry. That rivalry then completely erodes the trust and cooperation you need for big, long-term projects. And of course, without cooperation, you can never achieve the kind of massive mobilization the CT path demands. We get stuck. The rivalry trap effectively locks us onto the default path of decline.
Okay, so if we're caught in this psychological trap, is there any way out? What kind of leadership could possibly navigate us through this mess? To figure that out, we have to look at leaders in a totally different way, not based on their ideology, but on how they function.
This table here breaks down 3 leadership types. You've got your traditional politician, who's pretty good at just managing the existing system. Then there's the spectacular populist, who actually thrives on mimetic conflict. Their whole identity is based on who their rivals are. But the rare type we need for this CT transition is what's called the innovative technocrat. This kind of leader can do something called mimetic decoupling. They basically refuse to play the old zero-sum games. They create entirely new systems of value and build real solutions that can scale, all while having the resilience to withstand the constant attacks that come with changing the status quo.
To even get to a place where that kind of leader can operate, you need a stabilizing force. There's an old concept for this called the kachon. Now, let's just think of it in a secular way. It's some power or institution that restrains chaos. It holds the system together just long enough to allow for a really deep fundamental transformation to happen. Its job is to keep the future open.
But this is where we hit a massive paradox. The very same power that's strong enough to hold back the chaos and enable a positive transition is also strong enough to do the exact opposite. It could be used to centralize all control, crush any rivals, and permanently lock down the future, killing off any alternatives. The very tool that could save us could also be used to imprison us.
So let's bring this all back down to earth. How can we see these huge forces, the systemic limits, the mimetic traps, the paradox of leadership, actually playing out in the world today? Well, let's take a quick look at Europe and the US.
The whole European Union project, its very legitimacy, was built on a foundation of constant economic growth. That growth was the glue that paid for cooperation and solidarity. But now that growth is stalling, that promise is fading. Suddenly, things like redistribution aren't seen as a shared investment anymore. They're seen as a zero-sum fight over a shrinking pie, and that's fueling these intense rivalries between the member states.
Now, the United States, it has these huge structural advantages. Tons of resources, incredible technology, a massive domestic market. It has the raw capacity to actually attempt something like that CT path. But its cultural fabric is also deeply woven with the promise of endless growth. So its biggest risk isn't external, it's internal. The danger is that this intense mimetic rivalry, this political polarization and scapegoating could completely sabotage the long-term coordination you'd need to pull off that kind of transition.
You know, when you boil it all down, even though they're very different, both the EU and the US are staring down the exact same set of fundamental challenges. They both have to figure out how to redefine what makes the government legitimate in a world without automatic growth. They have to manage the explosion of zero-sum conflicts. They need to build real material resilience, and somehow, through all that, they have to accelerate the very systemic innovation that might offer a way through.
So that's where we land. We have these incredibly detailed models that are mapping the road ahead, showing us the physical possibilities. And we have these powerful theories that explain our own psychology, why we have this tendency to swerve right off that road. The critical question for us then is no longer just what's going to happen. It's how will we choose to respond to what's happening? That's the real challenge.